Who's C? Oh, that's Carol.
Yeah, Carol's got a new.
And Aiko, I want you to get an A, so then we can be A, B, C, and then Tina's gonna put C, and then we'll be A, B, C, C. We're gonna take over.
Sounds good.
There's my guy.
Yep, there he is. This is kind of where we left off last time, but Barbara and I have had a week to think about this guy, and I think we've come up with some more stuff on Li Bo, or Li Bai, sometimes referred to. So we're just a reminder, we're using him to put an exclamation mark on the Tang Dynasty, which we've done, but we'll finish off the Tang with the poets, because he's got a buddy. So this is a little taste of his poetry, just kind of straight up. But notice the calligraphy. This is a new dimension. I want to talk a little bit more about that. But there's another dimension to poetry that we don't have, and we can't begin to understand. The one thing here is the moon. He's got this fascination with the moon that you'll see over and over again as we do him. And so the other thing, the other thing that he has a fascination with is drinking. Aiko and I saw this Academy Award winning One More Round that was kind of a disturbing celebration of drinking for people that work in the medical business. But it's interesting how Li Bo celebrates alcohol and drinking. And we certainly know some of our great writers have relied on alcohol. And if any of you have watched the Ken Burns Hemingway saga, that comes to mind immediately. But he loves drinking, and he may be hungover, but he fills his own cup again. And again, notice the calligraphy. Really quite sophisticated and remarkable.
I think they simplified. I think Mao simplified the calligraphy. That's the old one.
Yeah, and this is what they still use in Taiwan, and there's some tension between Taiwan and China on the written Chinese, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that more later. And so here he is, Li Bo, combining his love of alcohol with the moon. And that's going to play maybe the last chapter in his life, these two things together, as you will see. But here is drinking alone. And that's one of the questions that we are trained to ask when we're suspecting alcoholism. Do you ever drink alone? He did, and wrote it and bragged about it. And in a different setting, holding his wine glass up to the moon. Looks at the moon in the bottom of a wine glass for inspiration. He's out spending the night out of doors and drinking alone and looking up at the moon. And look at all the calligraphy. This is a dimension that we can't understand, but the calligraphy is integrated with the poetry, the words that are chosen, and the painting. So you have all three. And this is a straightforward expression of his love of wine. He did calligraphy himself, but a lot of it was lost. And this is the only surviving example of his calligraphy. So calligraphy, you go over to the Asian Art Museum sometimes and you see it being demonstrated. It's really quite an art and quite a discipline. Notice the elbow is not sitting on anything. Now, later on, apparently they made tables higher so the elbow could rest, but this is being practiced traditionally. And it's beautiful. And if you just looking at the lines, and you can understand how it could be an art form. And then there's something called semi-cursive calligraphy. And this fellow just did the calligraphy. He wasn't a poet. He wrote down, he was a scribe, and he was famous in his own right just for his calligraphy. So if any of you had a chance to watch the 2-minute YouTube animation of this poem, I hope you did. If you didn't, go back and take a look at it. But what this does, this slide, is it gives you all three. So it gives you the basic original calligraphy, and then it translates it into pinyin, which is a phonetic attempt with English alphabet to reproduce the sound of Chinese. And at one point, pinyin was a dream for the communists, that they were going to, I don't know if I should be using the word pinyin. They were going to introduce maybe it was Wade Giles, my nomenclature may be off, but they were going to try to Romanize the Chinese language and make it phonetic. And this is an attempt to do that. And there are a couple of systems, and it's the one reason why they changed the system. So we don't say Peking anymore, as I was taught growing up. We say Beijing because they've switched the attempt to Romanize to a different system. And then here's the English translation. So you've got all three things for one line. And it's basically the poem that Li Bao wrote about a guy, Wang Lun. Who's Wang Lun? He's a nobody. But he desires, he lives in a little village, living a simple life, but he is literate, and he really wants to meet Li Bo. So he's a real fan. He sends Li Bo a letter, says, "You got to come to my village." And he kind of tricks Li Bo to come to his village by bragging about it and exaggerating the qualities of his village. And Li Bo fell for it, but when he got there, he liked the guy so much, he bonded with him and bonded with the village. And then he wrote a poem and mentioned this nobody. And this was the kind of thing that he would do. And I think it's the kind of thing that endears Li Bo in the Chinese psyche. So if you're arguing with some Chinese person about foreign policy or something, just mention that you've read the poems of Li Bo, and apparently he's everybody's favorite poet. And then there's some subtlety, peach blossoms, and then he mentions Wang Lun. And to be mentioned in a classical poem, the name of a very simple man, was a real gesture of a common touch that he had. And this is the beginning of the animation, which I recommend you watch on YouTube. You have the link. So,
oh, can I say something?
I'm sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you know we have a friend named Chan who grew up in Taiwan, well, Vietnam, but sent to school in Taiwan. So she learned the old Chinese way of writing. And then Mao came along and he simplified the Chinese characters. And so whenever she writes to anybody in China, they know she's anti-communist, or they think she's anti-communist, because she has the old way of writing. You know, the people that grew up under Mao's rule, they learned the simplified characters, and so they could tell by each other's writing as to what their background is, you might say. Maybe not their preference, but their background.
So Aiko, we were talking earlier, tell me if you think this is right. I was astounded when we went to Japan and we studied the culture, the acceptability of public drunkenness. And then it's perfectly acceptable to go out with your boss late at night, get drunk and tell him off. And it always seemed like it was perhaps a release from Confucian discipline. A release from, like a court jester, being able to get away with stuff if you're a clown, or to be able to get away with stuff if you're a drunk. And I wonder if in Asian Confucian culture, that acceptability or willingness to forgive drunkenness started with Li Bo. But in any case, the end of Li Bo's life, maybe this is a fable, but as we've said repeatedly, civilization is the myths people believe. And one of the myths that people believe is that Li possibly drowned when he was afloat in a boat late at night, and he woke up drunk and he saw the moon's reflection, and he reached over to try to grab it, and he fell out of his boat and died.
Being pretty drunk.
Yeah. But he had a buddy. He had a drinking buddy. And together they collaborated. And a collaboration is where 1 + 1 no longer equals 2. You have two. You get a larger sum because of the interaction. And who was his buddy? It was Du Fu. And Du Fu's name is going to come up again 300 years later in the Song Dynasty. That's how influential his poetry was. And there have been books that compare and contrast and look at collaboration of Li Bo and Du Fu. And this kind of summarizes their differences. Li Bo was misbehaved and thrown out of the court. He became a hippie and really went in for fantasy and imagery. And as we've said, poems of the common man, which is why a lot of Chinese love him, and he's taught in the schools even now. Du Fu's a little bit different. He wanted to be a Mandarin, but he failed. And it was in his failure, when he wrote about his failure to pass the exams, that he wrote some of his greatest poetry. He was a little more stylized, and he lived long enough to see this big rebellion at the end well, it's actually towards the middle of the Tang. They survived it. But it was a time of terrible turmoil, and he wrote and sympathized with the people who suffered under that. And the literati of the day, they would gather together, and it's mostly men, and they would gather together and write down poetry and do slam poetry, challenge each other, have contests, and it was a upper class thing. It's just the Mandarins, because the language is so complicated, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. Then the common man's not going to be able to do that and is excluded. I didn't want to go any further with Tang without mentioning some of this multichromal statuary that we've seen in various places. If any of you are interested in this and know more about it, please volunteer to do a 5-minute segment on Tang sculpture. And then just the art itself, the subtlety of it, the grandeur, the contrast of the man being small and nature being big, natural elements. Now we get to the song and see how things are going to be just a little bit different. So there's a very short interval between the Tang and the Song. When we looked at our list of dynasties before, we saw that there was 350 years between the Han and the Tang, between 250 and 600. But now there's only a few decades. And it's because during the Tang, the Confucian system was strengthened. And when the Song came back, they revitalized it even more and modified it and made it more open to the lower classes. The other thing that they did was they looked more to trade on the ocean and the sea. And they also, because of this openness, maybe that's a metaphor, an openness, they did a lot more development in technology. We reeled off all the innovations that were achieved by the Tang, but we're going to see that there was even more. So the geographical expanse of the Song is much less than with the Tang. So you see there's not this limb going out to the Silk Road. That's been taken away by the Altaic tribes, Mongol and Turkic tribes, including the Uyghurs. And still there's some threat from the north, and we're going to see how that's going to be go from a small threat to a big threat. But Kaifeng is the central city to start with, and later on, Kaifeng's going to be overrun by the Jin, and then the Jin are going to be overrun by the Mongols, and then it's going to be lights out. But they moved to the southern Song Dynasty, and their center is Nanking, but mainly Hangzhou. And so that's the basic map. Here are the boats that they started building at the time. And we're going to see that the Ming keep this tradition alive big time. But here's the Santa Maria and Columbus's boat in comparison to some of these junks that were being built in the time of the Song. And the Ming, this technology is not lost, and the Ming are going to build on it. And they take to the sea in fleets of ships. Interesting enough, well, who are you fighting against in those days? I don't know exactly when Japanese pirates came on the scene, but we'll certainly see that during the Ming. Now, I want to talk about technology, and I in one of the videos I gave you, it's the one with Michael Wood, and the last part of it introduces you to Su Song, and here is a statue of him in front of his clock that he built. This clock is run by a hydraulic and mechanical system, and this is an automatic timepiece way in advance of what Europe came up with. So people will say, oh, he's the Leonardo of China, but the Chinese say, no, Leonardo was the Su Song of Italy, because he was 200 years earlier. I don't know if our Leonardo expert, Carol Morona, will accept that. Cities. When we were doing the cities of Western Europe, we came up with populations numbers, and we were always surprised that the leading city was China. Huh, that's interesting. We were studying about Rome and Spire and London and Paris. Well, they were in 1050 at the beginning of the High Middle Ages. They were at the bottom of the charts. But Kaifeng, where we are now, the Song Dynasty is the lead. So we're making that connection from a previous slide. And then with the Southern Song, 1200, the Chinese are still in the lead, but you've got the center in Hangzhou. Everything's been switched to there, and the population is even larger than it was in Kaifeng. So the largest cities, they supplanted Rome and Constantinople. And so by the year 800, Chang'an, that was Xi'an in the Tang period, Xi'an, still Xi'an before the fall of the Tang. And then it passes to Kaifeng by the year 1000. So the Chinese have been leading really since 700, 800 by the Tang period. There's one interlude in 1100, it's Baghdad, and that's peak Arab power. And the Mongols, as we've said before, put an end to Arab leadership. From now on, Islam is not going to be led by Arabs as it was for the first 500 years or 600 years. It's going to be led by the Ottomans, by Turkish tribes, and Persians are going to sneak in there a little bit later, going from the Arabs' assistance to having some influence of their own. Okay. And then in the Ming, they maintained their lead with Nanjing and then finally Beijing by 1500. And so, you know, we're going to end with 1500. We're going to end halfway through the Ming in China. But I want to get back to the Song and Kaifeng in particular. And in the YouTube, you see this magnificent scroll. And I'm just going to show a few outtakes. All this is from one very long extended scroll. And here you see some street scenes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about street life in just a second. Here, very, very busy. And how can they have such a large population before any European civilization? I think a lot of it has to do with boiling water for tea. That's just my own theory. But to escape the perils of diarrhea. You can see that there's still trade. You can see there's camels on the street. This is taken, I'll show you the original in just a second, a reproduction of a famous painting of the Grand Canal. So this is the link to the Grand Canal, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, linking to the street life in Kaifeng. And they've identified specific types of businesses that if you watch the video with Michael Wood, he'll superimpose the kind of businesses that these storefronts represent. It's quite interesting. And then in a museum in Kaifeng, they animate. So these characters come to life and start walking around. It's really quite spectacular.
It's in Shanghai.
And that's where the animation is. Thank you for that correction. And it really gives you a feel for what urban life was. And this is the #1 place in the world. And if we were all living and visited Kaifeng, and we visited any place in Europe, we would say, well, gosh, this is the future. This is where civilization is going. But there's a lot of reasons why that didn't happen, and we'll start to explore some of those in a second. Close up of the camels, the bridges. There's some famous Japanese prints that look a lot like this. Comes to mind, and the bridge across the link to the Grand Canal. And so let's talk about the Grand Canal. It pretty amazing. The southern terminus is somewhere around Hangzhou, Suzhou, and then links to Xi'an, Chang'an. But what it basically does is it links the two east-west rivers, the Yangtze in the south, and the Yellow in the north, Huanghe. Now it gets up to the north, and where does it end? Well, it turns out that the Yellow River changes directions. The closer it gets to the ocean, there's more silting. The more often it'll change directions. Often with catastrophic flooding, as you can imagine. But this is the Grand Canal, 1,500 miles long. You compare it to the Great Wall as a great example of Chinese engineering. And obviously, today we're seeing examples of Chinese engineering. And this is the original print that was superimposed on that scroll. And this is just another diagram of what it looked like later on, extending all the way to Beijing. Spurs were built off of it, going to different places. But what it did was open up trade between north and south without having to go out onto the ocean. Just having, and I don't know how many locks, but they mastered the technology of building locks all along here. And just some pictures of how it is today. It's still around. Parts of it are functioning more than other parts. Goes through rural areas, suburban areas, and then industrial areas. And then you start to get some party boats. And I think this is in Suzhou, a tourist attraction north of Hangzhou. The improvements that they made to the Confucian system, they allowed more participation from commoners. They made the questions more practical rather than a sort of obscure historical. And the corruption was brought under more control. As Ramsey has said that the life cycle of a dynasty is about 6 generations, and it takes the Confucian meritocracy about 6 generations to fall victim to corruption. And that's what leads to the instability, just human fallibility. I want to mention one episode towards the end of the song, and this is a reformer, Wang Anxi. He was an influential politician. Yes, there were cliques and coalitions in those days. And as we see today, it's usually conservatives against reformers, or putting it more bluntly, the super conservatives against utopians. And I don't know. We got a phone call. It's not ours. And so let's compare him to Bernie. He wants to come in and equalize. The landed gentry is having too much power. Sound familiar? And here is a painting with a very subtle allusion to that. The poem here apparently says something about the landlord's umbrella. You can barely see it. So here is some subtle criticism of the landed gentry yelling orders to the peasantry. The other point that I want to make is that this corruption on a recurrent basis means that the Confucian system isn't as stable as as sometimes we believe, because it does rely on the responsible management of the meritocracy. And here are just this slide emphasizes the periods of disunity, not the periods of unity. And I mention it because it kind of explains a little bit the obsession with the current Chinese government's desire to avoid any disorder or chaos. And we see them clamping down very hard dissension, which is not usually in the evolving liberal capitalism Western tradition. Obviously, we've got a lot of backpedaling in like places like Hungary and Poland, but it's not a enduringly stable society. Now, is ours? I don't know. You know, here we are after what, 250 years, whatever it is, beginning to wonder if democracy is stable, the peaceful passage of power. That's what it's all about. And they don't necessarily have the tradition when the emperor dies of having a peaceful passage of power. We thought we had that worked out, first with George Washington, but really with John Adams, who was the first one to willingly pass power on to an opponent, somebody with whom he had a bitter disagreement. And we've been following that even through Al Gore and the Florida debacle until this year. And it gives us pause. I thought that China had worked out the peaceful passage of power. They had for 20 years this idea that the prime minister would have 10 years and then that's it. It was like an informal term limits. And so you saw that happening until we got to Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping has assembled all the power to himself and undone that rule. And we'll see what happens when Xi dies. One of his heroes was Mao, and we saw what happened at the end of Mao's term. So the other thing I want to emphasize here is that this background also explains the Chinese obsession with Falun Gong. That Falun Gong cannot be tolerated. And you look back through Chinese history and you see example after example of these millenarian movements, these salvation movements, usually starting with Taoist type of mysticism and cults. And often at a time of disorder, that can be the final straw that brings a dynasty to the close. So just connecting some of this past history with current Chinese attitudes, I think is one reason I study history. So you had this reformer, like Bernie, he had big ideas, but you have this court historian, and he's quoted as writing some really wonderful histories, but he happens to be in the court when Wang comes up with his idea for reform. And he says, hey, wait a minute. These kind of reforms might undo the Confucian order that is existing now. And I want to point out, and he looked back at the last 1,500 years of Chinese civilization. So that's going back to the time of Confucius, 500 years BCE. Now it's 1,000. I want to point out we've only really had a good 300 years of absolute peace. So let's not mess with something that's working. And so you had, believe it or not, polarization between these two camps. And I just want to flesh this out and give a story as an example how polarization played out during the Song Dynasty. This is a conservative Mandarin poet who is on Sima's side in this debate. And he, at one of these gathering of the literati, wrote some poems that could be misinterpreted. His defense was, I've been criticizing corrupt Confucian officials, but his enemies said, oh, no, you've been insulting the emperor himself. So he struck back and said your poetry is just the sound of cicadas, which is an insult. But then he went on to say that Confucian officials are so attached to their salaries, they're like an owl's attachment to eating a rotten rat. And so that kind of insult led to a trial, and it's called the Crow Terrace Poetry Trial. What's Crow Terrace? That was the nickname for their secret service, the Imperial Office of the Censorate. And what do we see in China today? We do see the great wall on the internet. And some of this is an echo of the Imperial Office of the Censorate, just like what we see in Russia today with the survival of their and reincarnation of their KGB, the history of the Tsar's secret service. So you can see the germs of some of these unique institutions. And in both cases, we're talking about stability of the state and what the methods that the state will resort to keep the peace. So you have this trial, and this is in 1079, and he's indicted for denouncing the imperial chariot. What does that mean? Well, today we call that lèse-majesté. I don't know, somebody who speaks French, correct me, which basically means you can't do anything to insult the king. And where we see this playing out today, the strictest rules is in one of the places is in Thailand, but you can, where they have a king, but you can argue that you can't denounce the Communist Party.
His Majesty.
This is a poster characterizing what insulting the king would be like in Great Britain. This is John Bull. He's the British version of Uncle Sam, farting on King George. So that's Les Majestés. This is depicts has something to do with the trial. I'm not sure if it's the original poem where he insulted the Confucian officials or the emperor himself, or whether this is the trial. And he thought that he had disguised his critique of the Confucian court in the rhymes of Du Fu. So here he's taking, remember Du Fu we talked about earlier? He's taking Du Fu's poetry and he's playing with it. And of course, the ways that you can play with it when you throw in calligraphy introduces a dimension of complexity that our language can't even deal with. But there are ways to express the sense in Chinese by latching on to previous poets, previous verses, and playing with them and to continue to employ and expand upon rhythm matching, and you can link this to the paintings and the calligraphy. And so the question of how do you censor a language like Chinese is very interesting to me. I showed you earlier, right, that this is the only surviving calligraphy of Li Bo. But so what are the advantages of calligraphy? Well, just the artistic advantage, the way you choose to do the strokes can express your sentiments. But the other thing with Chinese language is that these are ideograms. These are ideograms, and this is very different than our alphabet system, which you can look and realize that maybe our system is a little bit artistically impoverished, that it can't reach the high levels of Chinese expression. And so this is an educated person has all these avenues to express dissent that we can't begin to appreciate and understand. But there's some disadvantages now in the technological era. What is this? This is a typewriter. And this has 2,000 different die to choose from. So the 2,000 die that you can use to reproduce a newspaper. This is what you need to do just for a typewriter. We're not talking about the computer yet. So, and this is a close-up of that. You can see all these 2,000 little characters, each distinctly different. So technologically, we're going to be talking about Gutenberg pretty soon. China had block printing 200 years before this. And then it was only during the Song where they would have individual die like this. So the Song were able to make individual ideograms for printing. But the process of putting it together into a book, much less into an essay, much less a book or a newspaper, is kind of hard. And so the calligraphers, the scribes, still had a lot of work to do. The BBC, Aiko and I had a discussion about this yesterday, so I looked it up this morning. The BBC says an educated person will know 8,000 characters. Then just think about all the options for expression that'll give you. But you only need 2 and maybe 3,000 to be able to read a newspaper. So this brings us to, I'm just going to do a little tangent for the computer age. What does a Chinese keyboard look like? Well, there's many different versions, and it's very hard. Here's another version but to do one character, you might have to put in 5 different strokes. So this is just a nice summary of the input methods. There's 3. One is just to render what you're trying to say into phonetic readings or root shapes. And that's easy to learn, but it's less efficient in practice because you've got to be continually thinking and choosing from different lists. The other is just to use root shapes. So there's, I think, about 212 root shapes, 214 root shapes that they use in making characters. And some of that relies on the sequence in which you make the strokes. So the Chinese dictionaries are based on the sequence of the strokes. It's getting pretty complicated, folks. But there's a very steep learning curve. You just have to be a master of characters to use a keyboard that uses root shapes. Now they're talking about just writing characters directly on the touchscreens. That'll be interesting. I think I got to do a time check here. I'm getting pretty close. I got maybe another 5 minutes. The other thing I want to just mention is with this Grand Canal moving goods 1,500 miles up and down, it's good to have paper money and letters of credit. And the Song in particular advanced paper money. The last of the Song is Emperor Huizong. Was he weak or was he just unlucky? It turned out he was spent a lot of his time pursuing poetry and the hobbies of the literati and hanging out with mandarins. So he may have been weak, but I don't think even a strong emperor would have resisted the Mongols. So here we are in 2000. Here's the map. Here's Song Dynasty. We're familiar with this map from the Russians. Here they are. They're sitting over here. They should be pretty safe from Mongols. And here's this little blue kingdom, the Mongols. But there's something cooking there. And as we remember, their first target is going to be the Jin. And then once they get the Jin, they're going to attack the Song. And the Song are going to retreat to the South Song in Hangzhou. And I think this would probably be a good place to stop because, spoiler alert, the Mongols are going to conquer the Song. And it's not Genghis Khan. It's grandson Kublai, who Marco Polo met, who is going to enthrone himself as the next Chinese dynasty. So the next Chinese dynasty is not Chinese at all. It's Mongolian. And first they take Beijing, and then Kublai Khan attacks Japan, as we studied before. One went by land, but two by sea. And the Great Typhoon on the second attempt is the kamikaze that we learned about. And this is, I think, where I'm going to stop. And when we return next week, I'll spend a little bit of time on the which is the Mongolian dynasty in China. And then we'll do very briefly the beginning of the Ming. And then I promise you, it's on to Italy. I'll do first the history of the Italian city-states in the Renaissance. We're just going to cover the 1400 to 1500 to start with. And once I do the history and the geography and the economy and the international connections, I'm going to have a trio I'm calling the Tres Amigas, who are going to help me out with the art. So it's going to be Ika, Tina, and Carol. So they'll be helping me out with the art piece. And we're going to spend some time there because for Juan Jose, he asked me, what is civilization? And I don't think I will have completely answered that question until he watches today's tape on the Song Dynasty, which is arguably the golden age of Chinese culture. And we get to cover the early Italian Renaissance. Obviously, there's a lot of Renaissance stuff north of the Alps, but we'll spend less time on that. But I do want to really drill down on the Italian Renaissance because it's really dramatic. Okay, so questions?
I have a question.
Yes,
Okay.
I go from Walnut Creek. How's the weather in Walnut Creek?
Very nice. It's not too hot.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Anyway, the Song in about 1000 AD, they were really prosperous. Lots of people were living. They were a huge population. And you thought it was because they boiled their water. Were they able to feed all their people as well? Because, you know, Egypt did so well because the Nile flooded twice a year. They were able to feed their people. Were the Chinese able to feed everybody with that huge a population?
Yeah, so the big thing with the Tang and the Song was cultivating along the Yangtze, and the introduction or the promotion or the expansion, let's say expansion of the rice culture. So, and it turns out if you look at the economy and the calories per effort, rice is one of the best crops to get you the calories.
Really?
Yeah.
Better than wheat.
Corn is, I think it edges out corn. But so it was a great expansion of an existing grain. So yeah, I say boiling the water to keep people from dying of disease. But you certainly bring up an important point, and I don't want to make that sound too simple. But there were a lot of factors, and I think the rice culture is certainly one of them.
Question. So rice, when does rice become a big crop? I missed your last week lecture. I haven't looked at it yet. Maybe you talked about that.
So no, I don't talk about it, but somewhere it's always been a crop, but the expansion of it and the deliberate encouragement of it by officialdom is in the Tang and the Song.
Okay. And in other countries, not so much yet?
Oh, but because of limitations, we're not going to do Korea and Vietnam and Japan. But yeah, certainly in all those Asian cultures, whatever happens in China eventually makes its way.
Yeah.
To all these other cultures, and it might be vice versa too. I haven't explored that, but it's quite possible that the Tang and the Song looked around and said, "Hey, they're doing something pretty good in Vietnam. Let's adopt it." I don't know that.
I find it interesting to hear what you said about rice, because some of you know my son David. And he's done a lot of research in the last 10 years or so about health and that sort of thing. And he's advised me to eat rice and to avoid gluten. So now I avoid eating bread and I eat rice and potatoes. So hearing about rice being a good thing for calories, apparently it's pretty healthy too.
Well, it's very interesting. In our family history, Aiko's grandmother died of beriberi from too much refined rice. So brown rice, if you have a choice, order brown rice. Now, today, I think white rice, processed white rice is reinforced with thiamine. I think that was what was missing. So there were some lessons to be learned along the way with the rice culture. And unfortunately for Aiko's grandmother, that wasn't soon enough.
But the thing is that in the South, I guess Kaifeng is considered Southern instead of Northern, but it was the population was pretty huge, more in the South than the northern part of China. And northern China was more a wheat culture, wasn't it, rather than a rice culture?
Okay, so, but remember, we've got the Grand Canal. So your rice is my rice.
I think one of the health scares, and I think it's just some rice. There's more arsenic that's being absorbed in rice
these days. Yeah.
Yeah, these days, not then.
Yeah.
But that's. I'm talking to Linda. Maybe Linda knows more about that.
So
I don't know.
It's interesting. Some of the arsenic, of course, comes from human processing, but of various products. But a lot of it is the natural erosion of the Himalayas. There's a lot of arsenic in Memnor Hills.
I couldn't hear you with the noise. There was a lot of arsenic.
I'll talk to you later. I'm not going to repeat that.
Okay.
Other questions?
So is the Grand Canal a major waterway now, or?
No, it's broken up. It's not. It's a major waterway in sections, my understanding.
But before the Grand Canal, it was the Egyptians, or who was it? Did somebody else do that? What is it? What do you call it when the water rises and the boat rises with it?
Locks.
Locks, yeah.
And bagels.
Yeah, locks and bagels. Who was the first who had the locks?
Israel, of course.
Israel?
No, I'm kidding.
Oh.